So, good morning everybody. So today we are going to continue our discussion in macroeconomics, and the topic of today is business cycle theory. So we are leaving what we did last time, that was growth theory, the long run economic growth behavior. Today we are going to talk about the business cycle, ups and downs. So let me quickly tell you what is the outline of the day. Well, first I give you a motivation, of course. You know, when we talk about the business cycle, it's a change of GDP. GDP is to produce goods and services within a country within a certain time, usually a year. And if we compute the rate of change, we have the growth rate. Sometimes growth is positive, sometimes growth is negative. If it's positive and above the potential, the long run growth rate, we call it an economic boom, a positive output gap. If growth is negative, well, you know, we call this a recession. And in this graph, you can see the dotted curve is GDP growth in the euro area over, the past two decades. And you can see, well, in some time growth was relatively high, and in some time that was a recent severe recession. Around 2009, growth was negative in the euro area. If you imagine that there is a kind of potential growth rate in the euro area, let's say around 1.5, so I draw a hypothetical line, the potential growth line, you can immediately see all GDP rates, the dotted curve above the potential growth rate, that was an economic expansion, so the economy was growing faster than in the long run, and all points in areas where the dotted curve is below this hypothetical red line indicates recessionary developments. But what is more important to consider here is the fact that now we can compare any economic time series to the business cycle curve, this dotted curve. And I just have two other curves here. The red one is representing the consumption growth, and the dark blue one is representing the unemployment rate, and the scale for the unemployment rate is here on the right-hand scale. So what can I read now if I look to this graph from this? Well, first of all, we distinguish two different aspects when we look to time series data in economics. One, we distinguish the direction of a variable, and we take the business cycle always as a benchmark. And when we look to the direction, we have two differences. One, time series can be pro-cyclical, or the opposite, anti-cyclical, or if there is no pattern in either way, then we call it acyclical. Another distinction we can make is regarding the timing of a variable. And here we distinguish between a leading variable, a lagging variable, or if there is no pattern, once again, we call it a coincident variable. So I will explain these expressions by this graph. First of all, take a look to the red curve, which is consumption, household consumption growth. So what we can see immediately, during times of high economic growth, that means when the dotted curve was high, well, also the red curve is relatively high. When the dotted curve GDP growth is low, the red curve, which is representing consumption growth, is low. So we can see there's a kind of relationship between the business cycle and GDP growth. So in terms of the direction, we could say, well, GDP and consumption growth is a pro-cyclical variable. They are in the same direction. GDP is high, consumption growth is high. GDP growth is low, consumption growth is low. So they are pro-cyclical. They are in the same direction. Now let's take a look to the other variable, which is unemployment rate. The blue curve here. And here we can see, well, during times of high GDP growth, the unemployment rate is low. So in an economic boom, the unemployment rate is low. Yeah, that's of course. But if there is a recession, well, the unemployment rate is high. Yeah? Then we have once again economic boom, unemployment rate is low, and then we have this deep recession and the unemployment rate moved upwards. So here we see a variable which is anti-cyclical. Since the unemployment rate in the business cycle is the opposite direction. High GDP growth, low unemployment rate. Low unemployment rate, like here, high GDP growth. So we have a pro-cyclical and an anti-cyclical variable as an example in this graph. But there's even more, right? We can also distinguish variables, as I told you already, regarding the timing of a variable. And if we look closely to this feature of unemployment and business cycle, we can immediately see that the unemployment rate is a lagging variable. It lags the timing of the business cycle. The business cycle is my benchmark. Here we have the peak, right, in business cycle growth. And the low point is not at the same time of the business cycle peak. Well, the low point of unemployment rate is somewhere here, a little bit delayed. So the unemployment rate is lagging the timing of the business cycle. And that is true for all points you can identify. Here we have the low point in GDP growth, and the high point in unemployment is a little bit later. So unemployment is a lagging variable of the business cycle. And that's very important to keep in mind, whether an economic variable is leading the business cycle or lagging a business cycle. So unemployment rate is a typical example for a lagging variable. Once again, if a variable has no pattern regarding the timing, we call it coincident. Yeah, sometimes maybe it's leading and sometimes it's lagging, so then it's a so-called coincident variable. So what are we going to do today? So today I try to explain the business cycle ups and downs. So the dotted curve, why do we have sometimes booms, economic booms, and why do we have sometimes economic recessions? And then the question is, if we have an understanding why we have these business cycle fluctuations, I ask the question, what can we do if we are in an economic recession to bring the economy back on track as soon as possible? And we will see there are two policy instruments, macroeconomic policy instruments. And one is called fiscal policy, and behind fiscal policy is the government, and the other is called monetary policy, and that is the central bank. Before we are able to see all this and study this, I have to introduce a new model. And this model is called the ISLM model. The ISLM model is based on 3 markets, and from this outline you can see how I will introduce this model. First we will talk about the goods market, and we will design a curve that is representing all the equilibria in the goods market. Then we will talk about the money market, and we will design a curve that is representing all the equilibria in the money market. And then we put both markets together first, and we will study the equilibrium of the money and the goods market at the same time. Frankly, that is a very simplified model, the ISLM model. And therefore, in a next step, I will also tell you a little bit about the labor market. And we will design a labor market equilibrium curve and also put this labor market equilibrium curve back into our model. Then we have the model, and then we will study certain issues with this model. We will study what is the impact, as I already mentioned, the impact of monetary policy to the economy, to the business cycle ups and downs. What can the central bank do in a recession? We will study the impact of fiscal policy in the long and in the short run over the business cycle. And then we will apply this model to study an economic recession. For instance, the last so-called Great Recession of 2009. So this is my plan of today. Let's start with part 1, the goods market. Probably you are all familiar with the goods market. The goods market is representing the market we already talked about in one of the first classes. It's based on the so-called income expenditure identity, which is representing GDP output is equal to consumption, investment, and government spending. And in an open economy, also net exports. Today, we keep it a little bit simpler. So we assume for the whole class of today that we have a closed economy. So in other words, net exports are zero. Next time, when we understand this basic model, we open up the ISLM model, and we will discuss then the open economy ISLM model. But today, we always assume there is no export, no import, so that's a closed economy. And what we will see in a second when we now move on to the goods market, we will see we can derive a goods market equilibrium. That is what we also did a couple of weeks ago. And then we design a curve that is representing all these equilibria of the goods market in a new curve. And we will see this curve is called the IS curve. And that IS stands for investment savings. So what are the crucial components of the IS curve? Well, as I already mentioned, it is based on the income expenditure identity. So we will see that consumption is important, and consumption is a function of income. Investment is important, and investment is a function of the interest rate. Government spendings, and that is exogenous, so we assume here the government is acting and it's given from the outside, so we are not modeling the government here explicitly in this model. And in a general setup, later on also net exports is important. Today, once again, we assume a closed economy, and therefore net exports are zero. So what I'm going to do now is I try to design this new curve, and we will see that this new curve, and we call this new curve, as I said, the IS curve, is a downward sloping curve. And it represents the goods market. So let me design and construct this curve graphically. On the left-hand side, in this diagram, you can see already a graph we used in the beginning of this class. We have a downward sloping investment curve dependent on the interest rate, because interest low, more investments, credit is cheap. If the interest rate is high, credit is expensive, low investments. So there's a downward sloping investment curve, and you see there's an upward sloping savings curve. That is what you already know. And then you see there is an equilibrium point in a closed economy, which is the intersection of the investment and saving curve. And now what I'm going to do is I transform this equilibrium point from the goods market. Yeah, this is the goods market here, into a new diagram, which later on leads to my ISLM model. Well, you see on both axes, here and here, there is the interest rate, the real interest rate, R. That's good. However, there is a difference here on the horizontal axis. In my new diagram, on the horizontal axis, we have GDP, output, Y. So, if I have this point here in the goods market, well, I see immediately there is an equilibrium interest rate, and I transform this interest rate level in this new diagram. That is given from the goods market. At the same time, this equilibrium in the goods market obviously is determined by a certain income level. So my savings are dependent on a certain income level. Let's call it Y1. Let's say Y1 is here. If I know Y1 is here somewhere, and I know the level of interest rate, you see immediately we are able to identify one point that is reflecting, in this new diagram, the equilibrium in the goods market. So now we have transformed, basically, the goods market equilibrium into this new diagram on the right-hand side. Well, one point is not enough to see a relationship, whether a curve is upward sloping, downward sloping, horizontal, vertical, or whatsoever. So we need a second point to get a certain impression what is going on. So let me construct this second point. Suppose, so once again the blue constellation is the same as before, but now suppose there is a new income level, Y2. So if there's a higher income, well, then what is going on? I save more money. I have more income, I save more. Therefore, in the goods market, my saving curve shifts to the right. This leads to a new equilibrium point here in my goods market. And now what I do? Well, I do the same as before. I transform this equilibrium point from the goods market to my new diagram. So first of all, you see immediately this new equilibrium is related to a lower interest rate, R2. So we have a new interest rate level here. At the same time, you see this is linked to a higher income, which is now here. So that gives me this new point. And now we have the first point and the second point. And if we assume there is a linear relationship, everyone can see immediately, well, if we connect these 2 points, they are all lying on a downward sloping curve. And this curve is now what we call the IS curve, because it is constructed from the investment and saving curve in the goods market. And the IS curve, and that is important, keep this in mind, the IS curve represents all equilibria of the goods market. It is designed as an equilibrium curve. That's it. Now we have the IS curve as a representation of the goods market equilibrium. The next question we have to address is now, what are the factors that shifts the IS curve to the left and to the right? Well, this question is quite similar to the question you already studied in Economics 1. When you talked about, for instance, the supply and demand curve, you said, well, supply and demand is a relationship between price and quantity. And then you studied in a second step, what are the factors that shifting my demand curve, for instance? And you said, well, a higher household income shifts my demand curve outside, to the right. And we do the same study here. First, we have derived the curve, and we have seen the IS curve is downward sloping. And now we are talking about the factors shifting this curve to the right or to the left. So what are these factors? Principally, it's very easy to answer. The key factors that shift my curve, that change the position of my IS curve, is consumption, a change in consumption, investment, or the government spendings. So the 3 factors I already mentioned are the key factors that will change the position of my IS curve. And the rule is the following. The greater one of these 3, consumption, investment, government spending, the IS curve shifts to the right. If one of these is lower, the IS curve will shift to the left. I will show you this in a second. But let me give you some examples what is behind a change in consumption, investment, and government spendings. For instance, so if you have higher income, or if you expect higher income, well, then maybe you start to increase your consumption. That leads to higher consumption, and this higher consumption will lead in the end a shift of the IS curve to the right. So the same can be happen if you have a higher consumer confidence, because the economy is doing well, and you say, well, it works out, let's consume. Another issue. Or suppose there are higher transfers. So the government gives you more money for families, for instance. Yeah, they increase the transfer payments for families, or they lower the taxes. Well, then you have more money in your pocket. And a simple way you would conclude, well, then I can increase my consumption. That will lead in the end to a shift to the right of my IS curve. Here I have to tell you that this thinking is only true if we assume that the so-called Ricardian equivalence fails. So only a so-called non-Ricardian household would reason, in this case in particular when we talk about the taxes and the relationship to consumption. So only when you are non-Ricardian or Ricardian equivalence fails, this is true. So what is the Ricardian equivalence? That is the question. Well, it's a very important concept in economics, and there's a lot of theoretical discussion and empirical studies about this. And some empirical studies argue, well, the Ricardian equivalence is true, and some empirical studies and theory argues the Ricardian equivalence fails in reality. So let me explain the Ricardian equivalence, and then you can make your own conclusion out of this. If you reason like this, if you have lower taxes means I have more money in my pocket, and if I increase consumption, then I would label you a non-Ricardian, because the Ricardian equivalence fails. So what is the opposite? What is a Ricardian person? Let's say I'm a Ricardian, and I reason, the lower the taxes today, I will not increase my consumption. I will keep my consumption or even lower my consumption. Why? Well, if the taxes are lowered by the government, I have to think about where does the money for the government now comes from if they are having lower tax revenues because they lower the tax rate. So where does the money come from? Well, there is only one alternative. If it's not taxpayers' money, they have to finance it with a new deficit. But if they finance this investment with new deficit, at some point the government has to repay this deficit. And how can the government repay the deficit? Well, with taxpayers' money. So in future, if they lower taxes today and they finance the spendings with deficits, then they have, at some point in the future, they have to increase the taxes again to repay the deficit. So if I anticipate this behavior, well, then I would conclude immediately today, if they lower the taxes, then I know, okay, in future, maybe tomorrow, they have to increase the taxes again. And therefore, I will not change my consumption behavior. I will not increase consumption, because I anticipate already today that the lower taxes today lead to higher taxes tomorrow. And people who reason like this and do not change then the consumption respectively, they are called Ricardians. So they have a more, let's say, a long-run view or a sustainable view of the economy. The non-Ricardians do not care. They say, well, I have lower taxes, more income in my pocket, I consume more. But if you take into account that somewhere the money must come from, and if you anticipate lower taxes today leads to higher taxes tomorrow, Ricardian equivalence, that is the Ricardian equivalence, this idea, then you will not change consumption. And due to the fact that we have people who reason in a non-Ricardian way, and we have some people in our society who reason in this Ricardian way, it's not really, you cannot say this one is true and this one is not true, it depends. But it's important to keep both issues in mind. So let me continue the list. So what are other elements that have an impact on the position of my IS curve? Well, what are the effect on the investment curve? For instance, if we have a different interest rate, yeah? So if we expect lower interest rates, well then, obviously it's more attractive to invest and investment will go up. Or if we have higher business confidence, well, that also leads to an increase in investment. Or if we have lower corporate tax rates, and now the corporations have more money, well, that also have a positive effect on investments. And as long as investments increase, the IS curve shifts to the right. Once again, regarding government spending, we can say that the two key issues for the government or the sources of finance are either the tax revenues or the deficit. So if we have higher tax revenues, the government can spend more, or if they increase the deficit, they have also more money, the government can spend more, that increase my G, and therefore shift the IS curve to the right. So these are the three factors. So keep in mind, a change in consumption, investment, and government spending, and any factor that has an impact on these three variables will change the position of my IS curve. An increasing effect on these three variables shift the IS curve to the right. A decreasing effect on these three variables shift the IS curve to the left. So now let me show you that this is true, that it shifts to the right or to the left in one case. So once again, the blue case is what we designed already when we designed the IS curve for the first time. Now suppose we have the same income. We have the same income. However, the economy, the overall economy is sliding into a recession. And due to that effect, the consumer confidence lowers. So you are less confident about the economy. So that your income is the same, your job is the same, your income is the same, but you are less confident. And due to that effect, you don't know whether you have your job tomorrow or you are fired. You start already saving a little bit more today for the bad times ahead. So again, now same income, but you increase your saving because of a fall in consumer confidence. So we obtain a new equilibrium point at this lower interest rate, R2. But now this new interest rate level and this new point is reflected to the same income level, Y1. The income has not changed in this case. So what we see immediately now, we have an equilibrium point below the blue curve. And now we can design a second point, and you will see, well, all these new points, they are now on this red curve. And the red curve is below the blue curve. So the IS curve now shifted to the left. Why has the IS curve shifted to the left? Because of a fall in consumer confidence. And a fall in consumer confidence means less consumption. Lower consumption, a lower C, shift the IS curve to the left. Vice versa, if we have an increase in consumption, it will shift the IS curve to the right. So here you can see that the reasoning I told you on an abstract way on the slide before is true. That is the graphical proof. Any question to the goods market? No. Okay, now let's continue with the second market, the money market. Sometimes also called the asset market, because it's not just about coins and notes. So what is the money market about? Well, the money market, as any market in economics, consists of two elements, supply and demand. What is important here, that this market is new, right? So far we have not talked about the money market. In the Solow model, the Solow growth theory, there was no money. There was no money market. Here, it's the first time we talk about the money market. So the money market consists of a supply side and a demand side. So what is behind the supply side? Well, behind the supply side is the central bank. The central bank provides liquidity, provides money. And that is indicated by this M, which is, you can say, money supply. And due to the fact that we study in economics, in particular in macroeconomics, always real variables and have real economic models, well, money is a nominal variable. To get the real variable, we just have to divide money by the price level. And that is actually what we have here on the left-hand side. It's money divided by the overall price level, and that is the real money supply. And once again, the central bank is the key player here. The central bank affects the M. the nominal money supply. On the other side of this market, we have demand. And demand is a function. It's called L for liquidity demand. And it's dependent on two variables, on income, Y, and on this term, which is the nominal interest rate, I. And due to the Fisher equation we talked about, the nominal interest rate is equal to the real interest rate plus the expected inflation rate. So, now let me talk about a little bit about this liquidity function to get an idea what is behind this liquidity demand. In particular, I'm interested in the question, what happens with my liquidity demand if one of these factors inside the liquidity function, though the income and the interest rate, is changing? So what happens? So in a more mathematical way, I'm interested in the differential or the derivative of this liquidity function in respect of income. So what happens if I increase income? Does liquidity demand increase as well? So is this relationship positive or is this negative? So with higher income I demand less liquidity. And secondly, I'm also interested in the derivative of this liquidity function in respect of the second component, which is the nominal interest rate. And I want to know, is this relationship positive or is this relationship negative? I use here the partial derivative because I have a function of two variables and not just one. Therefore, it's a partial. We have to look to the partial derivative of the liquidity function in respect of income, first variable, and we have to look of the variable demand in respect to interest rates. So let me talk about this relationship. Suppose I'm in front of a cash machine and you are by sides also in front of a cash machine, one of you. Yeah? We both have a date in the evening and we need money, of course. We have to pay the bill in the end. So we both have an income. Well, I'm a little bit older than you. Suppose my income is a little bit higher. You are a student, right? Income is always short. Okay, so when I think about, okay, I have a date today, so what is the income I need? I would say, well, I need, let's say, 100 euros. You say, well, date today, student, 20 euros. Okay. So what you would reason, and that makes sense, the higher the income, usually the higher the liquidity demand. Yeah? If on the right-hand side of me is a very rich person, I have no idea, let's say Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or so, same situation, he would say 1,000 euros for the date. Yeah? Okay, higher income, higher liquidity. So in simple words, there is a positive relationship between income and the liquidity demand. And sometimes I indicate this by just writing a plus sign below this variable to indicate the higher the income, the higher the liquidity demand. Positive relationship. Or in other words, the first partial derivative of the liquidity function is positive. Now let's talk about the second variable. Same situation. I'm in front of the cash machine. And now I think about what is the effect of the interest rate on my demand, on my liquidity demand. First of all, we have a constellation. The interest rate is 0. Similar as it is today, almost 0. So it does not matter whether I hold the money on my saving accounts or in the pocket, because the interest rate, even the money is on my saving account, is 0. So it has no real difference here. But suppose now a second constellation. I'm in front of the cash machine and now the interest rate on my savings account is 10%. Then I say, well, it's more attractive to keep some money at the saving accounts instead of in my pocket, because I earn 10% return if it's on my saving account. And due to that fact that I know I earn a good return, if I keep the money on the saving account, I demand less. Though the higher the interest rate, the lower is the liquidity demand. Because it's more attractive if the interest rate is high to keep the money on the saving account. So there's a negative relationship between the interest rate and the liquidity demand. High interest rate keeps the money on the saving account, low liquidity demand on the cash machine. I just demand for, in this case, when I have the date, let's say 80 euros, not 100. I keep 20 on my saving account. Okay, and to indicate this, I sometimes write a minus below the second factor to show and that there's a negative relationship between interest and liquidity demand. Okay, so this is in brief the money market in this model. Very simplified, of course, but now what I'm going to do next is I will plot a graph similarly to the goods market. And if I have the money market graph, I transform the equilibrium from the money market into this new diagram we used already for the IS curve. And then if we have these two curves, we bring both together. So let's do this. First of all, this is now the so-called money market. The money market consists of, once again, the supply side and the demand side, which is this downward sloping curve. Well, you would say demand curves are always downward sloping, therefore it's obvious that the demand curve looks like this. But I already mentioned that there is a negative relationship between interest and liquidity demand, and that is what you can see by a downward sloping curve. Why is the supply curve just vertical? Well, because I assume here the money's supply is exogenous given by the central bank. So they have no impact here with the interest rate. So it's just given, it's independent from the interest rate so far. And therefore we represent such a situation by a vertical line. And what we see, if we have a downward sloping line and vertical line, there's an intersection point, and that is the money market equilibrium. So this is a money market. Now, let's use the money market here on the left-hand side and transfer or form this point, this equilibrium point, into this new diagram where on the vertical line we have the interest rate, on the horizontal line again income. You can immediately see in the money market we obtain the equilibrium interest rate, which defines once again a certain interest rate level. And at the same time, this equilibrium point obviously is related due to my liquidity demand to a certain income. Let's call it the income Y0. And this income level Y0, let's say, is here. So once again, we have the interest rate level, we have the income level. That gives me 1 point in this new diagram. To see whether now all the equilibrium points in the money market are on an upward or downward sloping curve, well, we just have to find a second point, right? And if we assume a linear relationship, then we can say and see what is going on. So let me again design a second point. How can we do this? Well, it's the same idea. Suppose we increase income in the money market from Y0 to Y1. Y1 is greater than Y0. Then this is the point we already designed before. And then we have, due to the higher income, that is what we discussed already. The higher the income, the higher the liquidity demand. So the liquidity demand function shifts to the right in the money market. That gives me a new equilibrium in the money market, and therefore a higher interest rate. For this higher interest rate is related to this higher income level, y1. So we are able to find a second point. And now we connect these 2 points and you see immediately, well, the LM curve is an upward sloping line. And even more importantly, the LM curve is representing all equilibrium points of the money market. Now I do the same as I did a couple of minutes ago for the IS curve. I have to discuss with you what are the factors that shift the LM curve to the left and to the right. By the way, we call this curve the LM curve because the L represents liquidity and the M represents money. So you can say it's a liquidity money curve and it is representing all the equilibria of the money market. So what are the factors that shift the LM curve? In simple words, it is money supply. So it's the central bank who may increase or decrease the money supply for the economy. And the more money supply they pump in the market, that leads to a shift to the right of the supply curve, because it is an increase here in the numerator, and if this is higher, then the supply curve shifts to the right. And if something is shifting to the right in the money market, the LM curve shifts to the right. It's the same as we talked about in the IS curve. Is some factor increase in the goods market or is increasing in the money market? In this case, it has a positive effect. It shifts the LM curve to the right in this case. Another factor is the price level. Suppose we have a lower price level. That means the P, which is in the denominator, lowers. But if we have a lower factor in the denominator, then the whole fraction, which is M over P of real money supply, is greater. So a lower price, which is a factor in the denominator, increase the real money supply. And once again, as the real money supply increases, that shifts the money supply curve in the money market to the right. And if this is shifting to the right in the money market, then the LM curve will shift to the right. So these are the two major factors you have to keep in mind here in the beginning. So let me show you this graphically again. First of all, the blue curve is representing the curve we already constructed. We have seen that the money market, which is in the left-hand diagram, can be reflected by an upward sloping, all the equilibria of the money market can be reflected by an upward sloping line, the LM curve. Now, suppose the central bank increase the money supply from M0 to M1. So the central bank pumps more money into the market. Well, as I said already, that shifts the money supply curve in the money market to the right. And now we have this new curve, this money supply curve, the red one. This red one leads to a new equilibrium in the money market. That gives me a new interest rate level, let's say R1. This new interest rate level defines a certain level here. This new level, however, is reflected with the same income, right? In this case, the income has not changed. It's just the money, the money supply has increased. My income and my liquidity demand has not changed. So the income is the same. So given this new interest rate level and the initial income level, well, that shows you immediately there is a new equilibrium point in my new diagram. And this new equilibrium point is not on the blue curve. It is below. It is on this red curve. Yeah, if we design a second point, we can see that once again it's upward sloping, but the new LM curve is on the right-hand side of the old one, the blue one. So what can we see again? An increase in money supply shifts money supply, this is this curve, to the right, and in the end it shifts my LM curve to the right. And the LM curve is representing all the equilibria points in the money market. Vice versa, if we lower money supply, well, then the money supply curve shifts to the left, and we will see that the LM curve shifts to the left. So it's the same idea as we already discussed for the IS curve, which is the goods market. Now, here we discussed the LM curve as the equilibrium curve, and we talked about what are the factors shifting the LM curve. Let me sum up what we have talked about so far. First, we talked about the goods market. The goods market is based on the investment and saving curve. It comes from the income expenditure identity. And so the key factors that are driving the goods market are consumption, investment, and government spendings in the closed economy. And what we did, we looked to the goods market. We designed a new curve, the IS curve, that is representing all the equilibria in the goods market. And we have seen that the IS curve is a downward sloping curve. And then we have talked about what are the factors that shifting this downward sloping curve to the left and to the right. And what are these factors? Well, consumption, investment, government spending, the driving forces of the goods market. Then we talked about the money market. Money market is based on money supply and money demand, or liquidity demand. And we looked to the money market. We designed an equilibrium curve that is representing all the equilibria in the money market. That is called the LM curve. The LM curve is upward sloping. And we talked about the factors that shift the LM curve to the left and to the right. And the easiest factors, the two most important we talked about so far, is money supply and the price level. And now what we are going to do finally is we bring both curves together. The IS curve, which is representing the goods market, and the LM curve that is representing the money market. And that gives me the IS-LM model and the equilibrium. So let's show the IS-LM model. That's it. It's based on a diagram where we have output on the horizontal, the interest rate on the vertical axis, and we have an upward sloping LM curve, which is representing the money market. We have a downward sloping IS curve, which is representing the goods market. And here you can see the key factors that have an impact on the position. Higher money supply will shift the LM curve to the right. Lower price level, because the price is in the denominator, will also increase real money supply and shift the curve to the right. Lower interest rate leads to more liquidity demand, shift the curve to the right as well. And for the IS curve, we talked already about the factors. It's consumption, investment, government spending, and any other factors like taxes, transfer, that have an effect implicitly to investment or consumption or government spendings. So what we can see now from this model, looking to the IS curve and the LM curve together, well, they intersect, because one curve is upward sloping, one is downward sloping. There's an intersection point, and that is our equilibrium. Let's call it E. We can call this point also, this is a kind of general equilibrium of the macroeconomy, because this point reflects an equilibrium in the goods market, and at the same time an equilibrium in the money market. So all the markets we looked so far are in equilibrium in this point, because any of these two curves represent already equilibrium points in each market. And therefore, it's a general equilibrium in the macro economy. Now, you may ask, why I'm telling you all this, and why is the IS model here of importance? Well, I can tell you that the charming of the aspect of the ISLM model is that it's so simple. And the approach is graphical. And this is a standard undergrad model you can see and read in almost every standard undergraduate macroeconomics book. And the interesting fact is that even if you have not studied business or economics, people in politics with a background in law or in some other field, and if you talk with these guys about the business cycle, the ups and downs, what is going on, what can the central bank do, what can the government, the fiscal policy do, if you talk with these persons, they have no idea about the ISLM model, but they argue, as you will see soon, with the same model. They use the same model implicitly without knowing this model. And that is the reason why this model is so influential. It's so simple, and everyone, even without a background in economics, implicitly use this model to analyze and to study the impact of fiscal and monetary policy. What is going on? Policymakers. So I experienced this in my own job when I did some advice to policymakers, as you know, in Berlin and in Brussels, in Europe. And if you talk with persons, they have no background, let's say, in economics, they have a legal background or whatsoever. But if you talk with these persons about the economy, about business cycle situations, the impact of monetary policy or fiscal policy, they understand what is going on. And they use actually this idea. And therefore it's a benchmark framework, and students learned it for 4 decades, and probably they will learn for the next 4 decades, because it's a relatively easy framework to make a consistent argument what is going on in an economy over the business cycle. So far, we have not talked about the labor market. So let me tell you at least a few words about the labor market. So what is the labor market about? Well, the labor market is, as any market, again, about supply and demand. But we have to distinguish between short-run behavior and long-run behavior. Well, in the short run, if there is an increase in demand, well, then a firm would hire more people to produce more because there's more demand. But in the long run, well, there should be an equilibrium, right? You cannot just increase this demand forever and forever. At some point, you cannot find a new person, a new worker, or you cannot demand from your existent workforce to work already instead of 40 hours, 80 hours a week. Yeah? So at some point, you will come back to a long-run equilibrium. And this long-run equilibrium is once again determined by our supply side, by the production function of the supply side. So in the long run, workforce, labor force, that leads to a certain potential output. That's somehow linked to this long run we already talked about in the Solow model, the growth model, the potential growth rate, the long run. So, from this perspective, we see immediately that the link between labor and output is independent from the interest rate, in the long run at least. And therefore, let me show the graph, and therefore the labor market can be represented in the ISLM model by a vertical line. A vertical line in this diagram means it has no effect, the interest rate has no effect. This line, this output level is determined by my labor force. And if the labor force or the capital stock or my technology increases, that will shift, obviously, the equilibrium curve of the labor market to the right. So the blue curve is the equilibrium curve, in other words, of the labor market, and it's called the FE curve, the full, so this is a short FE, it's a full employment curve. So in this diagram, you can now see the complete model. And the complete model consists of the LM curve, upward sloping, the IS curve, downward sloping, and the labor market equilibrium curve, the FE curve, vertical for the labor market. So let me go back for a second and once again talk about what are now the factors that may change this curve. Yeah? Now we have seen it's a vertical curve, but what are the factors that shift this curve to the right and to the left? Well, for instance, the tax rate has an effect, but also the value of the leisure time, the working age of the population, the total factor productivity. So all the factors that change my production function somehow may also change the equilibrium curve, this vertical full employment line I have illustrated in this model. Now we have, in a sense, a complete description of an economy, because this model represents, with the IS curve, the goods market equilibrium, with the LM curve, the money market equilibrium, and with the FE curve, the labor market equilibrium. And if all the three curves intersect in one point, then we have a general equilibrium. All the markets are in equilibrium in this special point. That's the famous IS-LM model. And due to the fact that the full employment line is just a vertical line, and so the impact of this line is not so big, in many textbooks and in many discussions later on in my class as well, I skip this. Yeah, I'll leave it away for a second and just look to the two important curves in markets in the macroeconomy, which is the goods market represented by the IS curve and the money market represented by the LM curve. So these are the factors that shift the curve. We already talked about the factors. It's all the factors like technology, capital, labor that may change the production function. Now let me discuss and give you one example that you can see the working of this complete IS-LM model. Suppose there is a decreasing productivity. There's a decrease in A. Remember, A, in my production function, we already talked about this in the Solow model. That's my technology variable. So if this is lower, well, then you know immediately with the same input factor, you produce less output. So this will shift the full employment line, as you can see, from the blue one to the left to the red one. So we have less output. But now something is happening. You see, in the beginning we had a kind of total equilibrium or general equilibrium. All the markets are in equilibrium in the beginning. But now, what is going on here? Where is now my equilibrium, right? Is the equilibrium here, or is it still here? Or is the equilibrium point here? Come on. I make a so the decrease in A, the decreasing A leads to a shift to the left of the full employment line. And now something is happening. The question is, where is now my equilibrium? Is the equilibrium still in the initial one? Or is the equilibrium here this one or that one? So what is going on here in this constellation? Well, now we have the following case in this example. This lower A leads to a lower production, lower demand, a lower supply first of all. And this leads to an increase in the price level. And the increasing price level, as we know, which is here in the denominator, if the price level increases, then the whole fraction declines. And that shifts my supply curve, the money supply curve, to the left, to this red curve. So we have a new equilibrium point as well in the money market. And that in the end, as we know, if in the money market something is shifting to the left, the LM curve shifts to the left. And you will see over time, it turns out there's a new equilibrium in this economy. And that is this point, connected with this new full employment line at a lower output level, but with an LM curve that has shifted up to this new level. And that has to do because of the production has an effect on the price level. And the price level will increase in this case. We are less productive. Yeah, we assume that productivity goes down. That has an effect on the price level. So the price increases. And this higher price level has an effect on the money market. The money supply shifts to the left, and that leads to this upward shift to the left of the LM curve. And we have this new equilibrium point then here in this at this level. So now you have a first impression what we will do next. So we will apply this model to different constellations, and we discuss then what happens if something is changing. What happens if the central bank stimulates the economy with more money, lowering interest rates, pumping more money in the market? Then we think about what happens in the money market, what happens overall then in the ISLM model. And that is what is telling us how can we bring the economy back on track if the output at the moment is very low. What can we do with monetary policy, and what can we do with fiscal policy?